Let's talk about something different. Now, Something Different is the first film in what is often considered the Czechoslovakian New Wave. Now, for a film student, someone who loves films, I don't really know a lot about the different waves. Of course, there's your classics like your French New Wave with Jean-Luc Godard or Francois Truffaut, your Italian neorealism with the likes of directors who I quite literally have already forgotten. And then, of course, there's German Expressionism back in the 20s. Uh, Pre-code, which is really anything without sound. I think I'm still not exactly sure how that works, but as you can tell, I'm not really good at putting things into boxes or where they sort of fit or sort of waves, I suppose, because I've never really seen films like that. I often watch films by director, not by what wave they're under, because I think genre is kind of silly and pointless and arbitrarily puts things into boxes that don't need to be in boxes. But I thought, look, I need to find a film to watch, and to be honest, I've been struggling to figure out what film to watch next. Typically, when I'm picking a film to watch, I'll pick something that I've heard a lot about, or I know a lot about the director, or someone has said, hey, go watch this film, or go watch that film. And then I'll watch all the films of that director. And that gives me a good safety net of typically 2 to 3 weeks. And by that time, they will have either talked about another director, or I will have heard of another director, or I've found another director to kind of explore. And that was a really good way to first learn about filmmaking, to learn how directors work. And it obviously functions under the medium that this is a director's medium. And not everyone believes it that way. And I'm not saying you should. I'm not saying the auteur theory is the only theory, but it is the theory I run by as a filmmaker, as a director. And so you can see a filmmaker grow. If you watch the work of Orson Welles, you can see him grow as a filmmaker. Same with Kurosawa or Michelangelo Antonioni, or one of a million other directors. And I've done this time and time again, and it really helps me understand what the director does, what their vision is, and how they work with actors or how they work in a certain world. And typically, that was how I did things. That, I mean, especially early on when there were so many big name filmmakers that I knew the name of, but hadn't really seen a lot of their films. That's how I would go about watching films. The problem is, having watched close to 1,200 films now, at least films that I've actually said that I've watched, which means only films I've watched in the last 4 or 5 years. That doesn't include any of the films that I watched before then. I have recognized that I'm running out of the big names, right? The one that everyone knows, right? The Spielbergs, the Kubricks, the Orson Welles, the Chaplin, the Keaton, on and so forth. The really big names. I'm running low on those kind of names, and I'm starting to get into different names, and I want to experience film differently. I've always experienced from the director's perspective, and again, there's nothing wrong with that perspective. I think it's a good way to experience film, but it also, I believe, sort of closes you off. And so lately, I've been allowing fate to take a much bigger role. Of course, lately because of this podcast and because of the physical video podcast, whatever you would call that, the vodcast. That seems like not a good way to say that. However you want to call it, whatever you want to call it. It's forced me to try to watch things that are popular or new. I did one on Another Round, which I never released. I did one on, or at least on video. I did release it on the podcast. I did one on a couple of other like Oscar nominees, of course, Nomadland, most famously, and so on and so forth. Just kind of try to be in the moment. And also, these are films I've wanted to watch for a long time and never were able to. And I'd still like to watch the rest of the films that were nominated for Best Picture. Not because they're nominated for Best Picture, I have a lot of problems with the Oscars, but because they're films I'm genuinely interested in. I'm interested in Minari. I have a postcard from Minari. It's been sitting on my fridge for like 8 months. I've been waiting for this film for basically ever. I really want to watch The Father because I've been hearing a lot about Anthony Hopkins' performance and just the experience as a whole. And there's a lot of other films that have come out in the last year that I'm interested in, but they're hard to find, and I guess I could illegally download them. And I don't have any moral qualms with illegally downloading a film. It's just like it's a lot of work, and I don't really want to go through the work, especially when I have the luxury of having basically every streaming service that's out there. I have Hulu, HBO, Amazon Prime, Netflix, Criterion Channel. I mean, those are the big ones. I guess there's like Paramount Plus or Peacock or whatever, but I have all of the big ones, so it feels wrong to sort of steal when there's so much free content out there. It just seems like a waste of time, if you ask me personally. Again, morally, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think art is made to be free, and of course, as an artist, I would love to get paid, and I do hope that one day I get paid doing this, but it's okay that I'm not paid. I'm not complaining. I still do this. Obviously, I would still do this if I wasn't paid, because I'm not getting paid. And so one of the ways I used to discover films is I'd go onto this streaming service called Filmstruck, which when Filmstruck shut down, it was one of the greatest tragedies for me in my short life. Although I've had a lot of different experiences, the shutting down of Filmstruck meant a lot to me, and I signed a petition along with hundreds of thousands of other people to try to get Filmstruck to stay. Of course it didn't. AT&T ended up buying out Warner Brothers or TCM or whatever, and Filmstruck was no more. Now, a year later, the Criterion Channel came along, and it had some similar stuff. And of course, there's sites like Kanopy, who offer tons of incredible films for free, but if I'm being entirely honest, even the Criterion Channel, although it's great and certainly relative to everything else, I think it's a very great streaming service, and the way it constructs video folders, I'm not really sure what you would call those, collections, I guess, is really interesting, but it does not at all compare to Filmstruck. What I love about Filmstruck wasn't necessarily the films they had on there, because again, you can now find those films on HBO since they own TCM, or you can find them on Hulu or Amazon or a Criterion Channel, but it was the collections that were so interesting. They made a lot of really thoughtful collections that, although Criterion Channel is attempting to do something similar, it's really not the same. But that's how I discovered films before, and it's how I discover a great director. And when I saw a film I really loved, to be like, oh, I'll watch all the films of this director. And so I'm kind of getting back into that since I'm back to watching a movie every day, and I have an excuse to do it now that I'm making a feature film and I have this podcast going on and all that. So today I was looking through collections, and one of the collections was New Wave Czechoslovakian, which I'd actually surprisingly heard of before. I'd only heard of it kind of as a joke because it's so sort of like it's small and minuscule. Like it's a very small part of the film world, and you have to be a real filmmaker to kind of know this. But I watched a film which I didn't realize I'd actually seen a film from this director before, the director of Daisies, an earlier film of hers. I won't be able to pronounce her name right because it's Czechoslovakian, so I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce her name. Maybe I'll like put it on the screen below, or I won't. I don't know. But I watched her first film called Something Different. I mean, there's a lot to be said about it. One of the things that's really interesting to me is it's actually two different stories, and they kind of interweave the two stories. So, with the one hand, there's the story a husband, wife, and their child. And it's clear that this wife, it has some very Jeanne Dielman vibes at the beginning, not in those long, slow, almost trudging pace of editing, but more so in just like it's a lot of housework and just kind of moving around and the drudgery. But what's so interesting, and I suppose juxtaposes, say, a Jeanne Dielman, is where Jeanne Dielman is very slow and boring and sort of torturous, where in this film they'll cut in these moments of drudgery with like moments of the kid screaming or the kid crying or the kid happy, or right, her showing love for the kid, and it'll just kind of move from one thing to another, and it's a really interesting cut because it's showing this sort of juxtaposition of parenting, I suppose. On one hand, it can be very boring and very just slow, but then on the other hand, when it's fast, it's really fast. And then, of course, the other story is the story of the gymnast, which I kind of figured going into it after seeing the gymnast do some of her moves that she had to be a professional gymnast. I wasn't sure what it kind of was. I guess it's sort of cinema verite, documentary-esque. I'm not really sure entirely how to describe it, but they basically follow this gymnast in a preparation for Olympic performance. And again, I'm not really sure if if this was like the actual following of it, or if she was... See, I'm not really sure. It feels very real, and either she is an absolutely incredible performer, or the director was able to get incredible performance out of this, or this was all very... there's these moments where the gymnast is talking to a reporter, and one of the most interesting moments in the film and she's just exhausted. She's like, I don't know what else to say. Like, there's just nothing else to say. And he's like, and the reporter asks, he turns off all his equipment. He says, what's wrong? There's this vulnerability to her that you almost never see in any sort of actor. And so it makes me think that these things are actually happening, which is really interesting to cap between a very fictional story and a very real story, especially because if it is a documentary-esque, then you don't actually know what's going to happen, and to intercut that with the sort of fictional story. So I wonder if like they shot all the documentary first and then they wrote the story based off of that. Because at first I was thinking you could make perhaps the comparison between the child and the gymnast, especially there's this scene where there's a male and a female coach talking to the gymnast, and you kind of see it from a distance, and you're behind all, and your view is basically blocked by these different gymnastics equipments, and all you really see are the bottom halves of them, although you see all of our gymnasts, and it feels very kind of like parental talking down to a child. And so it made me think that in a certain sense she is a child and she's treated like a child, much like this child is in the fictional world. But then I come to realize that's not really about the child, but I do think it is about the gymnast. And so what I realize is, yes, there's sort of a parallel to be made between the gymnast and the child, but I think the real parallels to be made between the gymnast and the mother, because even though the mother is taking care of the child, she often feels helpless. She doesn't feel like she can do anything this whole time. She just wants to do something, just wants to do anything. And of course her husband's just probably the worst person in the world. I mean, he's just like, there is no reason to like him as a character. Everything he's done is just awful. And yet he doesn't feel like an unrealistic character. It's not like a Darth Vader where it's just realistically ridiculous. He feels like a real character in a real film. And even though he's a terrible person, it feels like you go down the street and you would meet this terrible person. It's someone who, yeah, will work all day and then come home and read and never really take care of his child, which, I mean, not exactly great fathering by any means, although I can understand why some would say, well, she's not really a great mother because maybe she's a little rough on her kid and hits him every now and then. But if you see this child, he kind of deserves it. The child's kind of the worst. I kind of hate him. And I've talked about before how it's hard for me to ever like children in films, and I don't know why, because I like children in real life. Like, children in real life seem pretty cool, and I like working with them and, hanging out with them, and they seem like pretty cool people. But in films, I hate them so much, and this kid is just, I mean, a great performance, of course, and with any child, it's always a great performance, but I really do not like this kid, and every time he gets hit on the head by his mom or dad, there's nothing like, mean, like, there's no, like, sense of like evilness or meanness to their attacks. It's not like they're physically abusing him by any means, although I guess some would consider the light tap on the head to be that. Not that I suggest anyone do that, but he feels like he deserves it. If I'm being completely honest, he's kind of a prick. He just gets whatever he wants, and it's not really anyone's fault. I mean, I guess you could say that maybe the father and mother could not give in so easily to him, but he's also kind of the worst, and she's got a lot going on, which she makes this really good point early in the film, which, he's talking about, I've been working all day, I need to rest. And she's like, my work never ends, I'm always working, which is a really astute observation to make as, someone who is always on, because she's not only a mother, but she's also a housekeeper or homekeeper. I'm not really sure what the correct terminology would be, but she's a stay-at-home mom, which is often seen as this sort of joke of a job. It's not a job at all. Or on the other end, it's like, oh, this is work like anything else, but it's not like anything else, which is why it's so strange. Because a job, right? You can always quit a job or leave a job, or you're fired from a job, or you can stop, right? You can make a separation between yourself and your job, but she never can because they're intertwined, and the entire household depends upon her. I mean, I know he gets mad at her because she's spending money, and yet he'll go and do the same thing. And she actually says that line back to him, and he basically scoffs at her like she can't be taken seriously. Much like the gymnast through most of the story is a pawn for these other people, right? She's saying, I can't do this, I'm injured, I'm this, I'm that, and the other, and they're like, you have to do it. But the other thing, and I think this is an important parallel between the two, is throughout the whole film, the gymnast is just trying to do this very simple technique called a saltos or salto. I'm not exactly sure how you pronounce it, but it's basically just like I don't know, it's just like, I don't know, it's gymnastics stuff. Something with like it's basically something, it's like a handspring and then a backflip. And the backflip part is important. And she spends a lot of the film trying to capture this one moment. And although there are some like other struggles towards the beginning of the film, or her documentary film, this is kind of the big hurdle for her. This is the thing that she really struggles with during the whole film. And there's this incredible moment where the coach asks, why can't you do this? Jim, right? 7-year-olds can do this all of the time. Why can't you do this? And she says, because I can't see behind me. I can't jump into darkness. I'm terrified of this darkness. And the fact that this probably wasn't written, but it's just something that she says, makes it so much more poetic almost. And it just makes you wonder, are all Czechoslovakians this poetic, or are all gymnasts this poetic? Because the way she talks is absolutely beautiful, and she has some really interesting and intriguing lines. Again, going back to when she's talking to the journalists, and she just says some really kind of dark and sad things, and her trying to explore, how do you find meaning in life when this is all you have? All you have is being a gymnast, and if you, right, when you script as being a gymnast, you script everything, because it's her whole life. And much like for the mother at the beginning of the film, being a mother is her whole life. And then of course there's a triumphant moment where she does the backflip. Now what's interesting, by this point in the film, the mother has already taken the dive, and the mother actually took the dive much earlier than the gymnast did. The mother took the dive when, she drops the can and she meets the guy on the motorcycle, which is just like your classic, like, young hot rod, sunglasses, hair slicked back, almost very like a James Dean American-esque. And they have this sort of love affair. And I suppose some people I know kind of get bothered by when people cheat on people in movies. Honestly, I don't care. And to be honest, the husband's the worst. And I think, when I see this happen, all I can think is, good for you. You deserve this. You deserve better than him. The affair itself is really interesting. And you can see at this moment she becomes herself. She's no longer, and from this point on until really until almost the end of the film, you don't see the kid again, which is interesting because up to this moment she's basically defined herself as a mother, as the caregiver for this child, and at this moment she is herself. Now, who's watching the kid? I guess there's a nanny at some point. It's not entirely clear, but it doesn't really matter who's watching the kid. She's finding herself. She's no longer one with the kid. She's finding her own identity. But then, of course, like every relationship that's built upon, I don't want to say lies, but possibly infidelity, although he does seem to know that she's married, so it's certainly complicated. But you can see in that argument, there's this absolutely beautiful shot. It's one of my favorite shots, and honestly, all of cinema, it's just absolutely brilliant. And it's in this diner, and at the very left hand, towards the front of the screen, is the lover, right, the male lover looking out the window, and far in the background, all the way to the right, like literally almost being cut off by the frame. And also there's just this little heater or something, pipe that separates like her from the rest of it, is her, and she's like trapped in this little world. And even though they have this conversation before then and have this conversation after it, that moment just basically paints everything that's happening. Because when they're first shot together, it's them, it's open, right? They're in a bed, they're sitting around, they're laughing, they're having fun. And of course, with Czechoslovakian New Wave, much like the French New Wave, they're experimenting with the way they edit. So often they'll cut between like one scene and another, like happiness and sadness, and it creates this really surreal effect. It's very similar to the French New Wave, although I would say even more abstract and caring less about a message than it cares about a tone. It cares a lot more about a tone than it does any sort of message. And it creates a very surreal and interesting tone, and creates a certain sense of perspective, almost as if you're experiencing it as her, right? You'll have these these big ups and these big downs, and they almost seem to happen simultaneously. And in that moment, you realize that her relationship with him really isn't that different than her relationship with her husband. It seems to me that the reason it doesn't work is what she's seeking is someone who loves her, right? Who's there for her. And at the beginning, he's 100% attention on her, but he kind of loses that thread. And they have that sort of argument outside the diner or cafe or whatever you want to call it. And she says, he says, hey, I love you. I want to be with you. Why don't you care? And she says, my responsibility is to my family. And basically, at this moment, she basically says something to the effect of, I came to you because I want to do what I want. If I'm going to be, right, tethered down by you the same way I'm tethered down by my husband, that kind of misses the point. The whole point of this love affair is to be free, is to finally do what I want to do, and yet she can't. She's still tethered down by him. She still feels like she has to do things for him. She has to entertain him. She, at one point, asks for a kiss. And he says, what do I get in return? As if it's some sort of transaction that has to be had. That really is the breaking point for them. Of course, right after that scene is that beautiful shot that I described just a minute ago. And when they run out of the cafe, she just wants to be free. And she leaves him and never sees him again because she thinks her responsibility is with her family. And she thinks that's where she can find freedom. If she can't find it here, maybe she goes back to her family. Maybe she can find it there. And there is a moment of freedom. They're running. When I saw them in the snow, I had to ask myself, is that with the husband? Because it's a pretty wide shot and you can't really see who's who. Or is that with the lover? And it turns out to be the husband. And I think that's sort of purposeful because you're not really sure who it is at first. And they go to the exact same cafe that she went to her lover with. And I thought there'd be this sort of conflict. Like he would realize the whole thing was happening. And they choose to look over that, which is interesting, and I think it shows that this film, and perhaps so many films of at least the French New Wave, and it's the only New Wave I know, so I don't know about other New Waves, but it's not really that interested in conflict itself, much like Jean-Luc Godard's work is rarely ever interested in conflict, and a lot of Francois Truffaut's work is not interested in conflict. In the same way, this film does not seem to be interested in the conflict of being found out or being discovered. And then there's that interesting line that the son says, which he says, it's more fun without mommy. Which is interesting because this is the first time you've seen the kid in probably 30, 45 minutes. And just, I mean, of course it shows how just awful this kid is. I don't think it's supposed to show that this kid's a terrible person, although I mean, he's like 5 years old, so how terrible of a person can he really be? But I think it's more about him showing that he parallels some of the things that she does, which is that he wants to be free. And as a child, the only way to be free is not to be around your parents, because obviously the father just doesn't care at all. And so he sees freedom as being away from her because she is the only really parental figure in his life. The father is pretty absent as far as the father goes, at least in the scenes that we see him. He doesn't really do anything fatherly, and the son doesn't seem to show any sort of affection for his father. It's mostly just like a familial responsibility, but nothing more than that. And there's this lovely scene towards the beginning where the son takes the newspaper away from the father and says there's no reading at the table. He's much like the mother, he's looking for connection, but much like the mother, he fails, and the son and the father, much like he asserts his authority as the husband, as part of the patriarchy, he also asserts his authority as the father, as the patriarchal figure, and demands to have the newspaper back. But ironically enough, he actually has to have the help of the wife to get the newspaper back, which I think also shows the nature of this sort of Czechoslovakian patriarchy. And I know that as a female filmmaker, she never wanted to be called a feminist filmmaker, as so many female filmmakers never want to be called feminist filmmakers, just like Agnes Varda or so many others. And I wouldn't call this a feminist film because I think that really kind of misses the point, much like putting it in a box of New Wave Czechoslovakian or this or that or the other. But I think at this moment it is shaping the idea that the patriarchy requires everyone. It requires, in a strange way, it requires the women as much as it does the men. The men have to oppress, but the women have to allow to be oppressed. It's a two-way street, and that's not to say that the patriarchy is a woman's fault. Of course it's not. but it is perpetuated and is often perpetuated by an internalized monologue by the oppressed, whether it be the colonized or a minority of some kind or a woman in a patriarchal society. And so he can only assert his authority with the help of her, much like he can only assert his authority over her with the help of her. And then, of course, there's that triumphant moment for the gymnast where she does that backflip. And that comes around the same time, I believe, when she and her husband have a relationship, I should say, at a train station, which you think at that moment that the relationship has become good again. In that, at that moment, you're not sure if they're ever going to go back to that story or not. And so I was asking myself at this point, what exactly is that the moral of this story here? That if you just let your wife be happy, then you'll be a better person, or if as long as you're a man you can be a terrible person, but as a woman you have to always come back to your husband. I really wasn't sure what the story was there. And we finished the story with the gymnast, and it's of course triumphant when you see her kind of win those gold medals and just do spectacular and do things certainly I can't imagine almost anyone ever doing it. It's really just an exciting moment. And even though there's not a ton of conflict in that sort of story, right? It's just her preparing for this competition and doesn't seem like there'd be very anything exciting about it. There's a lot of joy in her winning. And again, I can't tell if this is real or not, if she really won this competition they're filming at the actual Olympics, or if they're not. I'm not really sure. But of course, then we cut back to the woman and husband, and the husband reveals that he has been seeing someone else. And the way he reveals it's kind of interesting because he doesn't actually come out and say, "Hey, I'm seeing this person." He's like talking in this really glib way, and she's like, "It's okay, I get it," because she thinks that she's been found out, but he thinks that she found out about him, and so he's just like, "Oh yeah, so you already know about whatever her name is," and they get in a fight and they're bickering back and forth, and she runs away and grabs the kid, and she says, she's screaming, I don't want to say hysterical, that feels sexist, but very emotional at this moment, as anyone would be, of course. And she brings the kid in and says, "You can't do this to us. You can't do this to us." And for him, he wants to leave not because of this other woman. At least to me, it doesn't really seem like he's leaving because of the other woman. It seems because he believes that the relationship between the two of them is over. That's why he wants the divorce. And she's like, no, we can work this out. We can work this out. And it shows the difference between the two of them, because for her, she really loves her husband, even though I don't know if there's a good reason to love him. Where he, on the other hand, doesn't really seem like he loves her all that much, if we're being completely honest. And at the end, with that scene, it seems like he doesn't love her. And yet they end up the three of them together. So there's just like, when it cuts back to them for their final scene, they're all three together, which is interesting, and I'm not really sure what to make of that. And as far as the gymnast goes, after she wins the gold medal, you think there's going to be this moment of, well, what do I do now? And she ends up becoming a coach, which is the interesting thing. They show her a coach is they actually parallel the opening scene, which is, as they do the title sequence, it's her doing her floor routine. It's like a close-up, so it's a lot like blacks. And this film, of course, is in black and white, so there's just a lot of space and negative space, and it's really kind of intriguing way to start it, and that's also how the film almost ends. And through this whole scene, you do not see her face, so you assume it's her, and then of course they pull back and you find out that is actually someone else. And our former gymnast is now a coach, and she seems fulfilled by this. She seems happy by it in a way that she didn't in as an actual gymnast. And I think that's part of the reason why that kind of final scene where they hold on her lasts for quite a while. I mean, a couple of minutes. I mean, for a film that's only an hour and 24 minutes, it holds for like 2 or 3 minutes, which is quite a bit of time. And I think it's showing that for her, the happiness was never about being an athlete. It was, I don't know. I don't know why I think she finally found her purpose in a way that being an athlete never did, but helping others become this makes her happy. And she seems genuinely happy. And as far as the fictional relationship goes, I don't really know what to make of it. I don't know what to make of any of it. So overall, I'd give this film an 8 out of 10. It's a really enjoyable film. I had a great time watching it. The editing is absolutely strange and weird and incredible. I think if there are any flaws to it, is it's pretty slow as far as film going. For a film that's only an hour and 24 minutes long, it feels long. And I recognize that that's just kind of part of the wave, and there's just not any real plot to the film. Again, part of some of the new waves, even though there's sort of a plot with uh, the mother and wife, there's not really a plot with the gymnast. And so, for that reasons, it's not a perfect film, but certainly worth a watch.